I'm excited to author 2729, an important policy change that will decrease the number of idle wells in the state and reduce the risks that they pose to public health. There are currently 21,000 idle wells within the state of California. Many of these wells have been idle for decades. There are 1,322 of those idle wells in my district alone, many located near farms, residences, and drinking water supplies. Santa Barbara and Ventura counties have a total of 2,299. Of those, 1,500 pass through drinking water of a TDS level low enough to be drinking water or beneficial use. The numbers are even higher if you look at all water protected by the Safe Drinking Water Act. Many of these wells have been idle since the 1970s and 80s, and this aging oil and gas infrastructure poses a threat to these sources of water in the midst of the drought. A recent study released by the American Geophysical Union measured methane leakage in both plugged and unplugged wells in 4 states. 40% of the unplugged wells were leaking methane. If we are worried about Aliso Canyon, we may have a collective Aliso Canyon between those 21,000 wells that is leaking an awful lot of methane into the atmosphere. Existing laws are insufficient to incentivize landowners to cap wells with minimal fees. It is cheaper for most oil companies to leave their wells idle than to get the work done and cap them. So the bill includes 5 main provisions. It refines the legal term idle wells. It increases idle well fees to create incentives for companies to plug idle wells, and the fees could be used by DOGGR to address orphaned wells, which unfortunately wells that are idle for many years often become an orphaned well when that company goes out of business. And so this would provide funds for us, instead of depending on taxpayer funds, to close orphan wells. It eliminates larger blanket super bonds that currently exempt holder from idle well fees. This is a practice that allows the largest oil companies with the most idle wells to pay very little. And it increases the initial bond fee and requires the bond to remain in place from the initial drilling until it is capped, unlike the current bond structure that only covers construction. Lastly, it allows for companies to craft aggressive idle well remediation plans in order to pay idle well fees. Of course, it would be our hope that oil companies take advantage of that. They can get out of those fees if they pursue an aggressive policy to remediate idle wells and close idle wells that will not be commercially viable anytime in the century. This measure will make a sizable and measurable difference in addressing the large number of idle wells in the state.
In October, we released a report, we called it the Renewal Plan, to overhaul the management and regulation of oil and gas in the state of California. A key part of that renewal plan are these 2 bills. The purpose of these bills is basically to strengthen our ability to protect groundwater, drinking water, water use for irrigation in California. Without that enforcement, without the improvement in enforcement that's provided in AB 2756, we very often can't even find a egregious violation with a meaningful fine. In other words, the deterrent is not there. With regard to idle wells, there's 2 concerns. One is that every well in the ground that is not being used is a potential risk to groundwater where these wells penetrate groundwater aquifers. The other issue is, as you accumulate a large inventory of idle wells, the likelihood that they eventually become an orphan well increases. Today we have many orphan wells in the state which we're now trying to plug. And the problem is, when we first noticed and find some of these orphan wells, it's usually because the neighborhood notices some kind of gas or odor in the neighborhood. And then we find out that the well is in a place that is very difficult to plug.